few years before me, right?
Yeah.
He studied cultural anthropology in Utrecht University. He studied in Bradford. What was it? Conflict resolutions. He studied in Paris, geopolitics and international relations. He defended his PhD dissertation here at Tilburg University a couple of years ago. I remember it was on October 25, right? Because my son was born late and I wasn't there, so I remember the exact date. A dissertation called, let me see, buiten, veilig en dan binnen, in- en uitsluiting van etnische minderheden binnen de politieorganisatie. Then you went to the Hague University of Applied Sciences to work with a lectoraat burgerschap en diversiteit, if I remember correctly, with Boukje Prins. No? Exactly. And now he is working as a postdoctoral research fellow at the VU Amsterdam. He'll give a talk about securitization, stupid diversity, deviants, and minorities. Well, things that are close to my heart and maybe also close to yours. I don't know. We'll see. I think it's going to be very, very interesting, and thank you for coming here. Over there and later over there, we have Kevin Karpiak. Kevin Karpiak is an American anthropologist who defended his dissertation at the University of California, Berkeley, with the title, let me see, because I don't know that one by heart, The Police Against Itself, Forming a Post-Social Police, and it was based on a police ethnography in France. And he's now working at Eastern Michigan University, and he will be the discussant of today. Kevin is really one of the people, he's the editor of Anthropolitaia, an online forum on policing, security, law, crime, punishment, and the like. And he is really one of the forerunners of a subdiscipline that we now can genuinely call anthropology of police, and I'm really glad that he's with us today. He is going to connect, and he's already there on Google Hangout, and he will record this thing, and it will be, if it's all up to standards, no, he will publish it on anthropolitaia.net. So if you want to, you can always look at this session again later at home on your computer. So I have nothing more to say. I want to give the floor to you. We have about 45 minutes. That's okay. Right. Then we have a 10-minute break, and then we have about 20 or 30 minutes for Kevin, and then the floor is open for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. Hi, Kevin. My name is Sinan Cankaya. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I actually worked for 5 years for the Amsterdam police organization. And it was at that time that I did my PhD research in an exclusion of ethnic minority police officers. I then went on to do research on what I'm going to talk about today, the issue of basically racial profiling. So I have the title up there, Policing Space and Race in a Super Diverse City. I did ethnographic research in the city of Amsterdam, sitting in the back of the police car, joining police officers on beat patrol, and I also did in-depth interviewing with street cops, so to say. And today, I will specifically focus on racial profiling as a threat, basically, for democratic and multicultural societies. Because the perception among ethnic minority communities of being harassed, brutalized, marginalized by the police is, and there are many examples, the riots in LA, the riots in France, Sweden, we had the riots this summer in The Hague. Every time the catalyst was an encounter between the police and minorities, there was the use of, assumedly, allegedly, police violence, which led to larger riots. So it is for that reason. I mean, I would say the main task of the police is to create safe havens for citizens, but at the same time, the monopoly on violence and the huge police powers of officers can actually also mean and imply that they can be a threat to certain categories of citizens in society. So I'm going to look at that double function of the police organization. And I will also discuss my research. Basically, it's going to be an empirical presentation of my previous research against the background of a view of society in which there should be, and that's my normative starting point, an equal distribution of goods and services, in which the state, namely the state, treats citizens in an equal way, and that there is also a distribution of security among citizens, and I mean this can be a challenge, because at some times, at some moments, there is this idea that specific categories of citizens should feel the burden of policing. Just maybe before I really start, I would like to share one of my favorite anecdotes, which I think is funny now, but not at the time, which connects the ideas, impressions of police officers of the outside world, but also on the inside world, so within the police organization. As I said, I did research on hidden exclusion within the police organization, and then I went on to do research on racial profile. So on this day, I was joining two officers on beat patrol, and I was already together with them for at least, which is an important detail, 6 hours. And we were just driving around, and we had nothing to do, we had no calls, which led the officers to do proactive police work, which apparently implies that they were on the lookout for more conduct youngsters. But we were in Amsterdam West, and there were a bunch of cars which were wrongly parked in that street. So we got out of the car, and the two officers started to write tickets, started to write fines for these cars. And at that moment, a Moroccan Dutch, we only learned later, came out of a car repair shop. So what was going on? This car repair shop, once they had repaired the cars, they put the cars outside in the street, and they were not allowed to. So this guy walks out and he's, hey, what are you doing? And then immediately the police officer so goes in escalation mode. She's like, this is the last warning. We came here many times. She turned around and completely ignored the guy and did as if he was not existing. He was still trying to interact with her. So, and you have to imagine, I'm just standing there, being the anthropologist, just observing this scene unfolding in front of my eyes. But more and more guys from the car repair shop walked outside. They started to interfere and to mingle. And I still don't know what exactly happened, but the two officers, they got inside the car and they drove away. I was still standing there. So I'm watching the police car leave with my jaws falling on the ground, and the guys are looking at me like, what are you still doing here? And I'm not exaggerating, like 50 meters in distance, the police car stopped, 50 meters in reverse, and then I got in the car, and the police officer, she turned around and she said, sorry, I just thought you were one of them. Which was, at that time, not something very fun to hear, especially after joining the police officers for 6 hours. But trying to make sense of it all, I think a lot of the images of police work comes together in this situational, contextual scene. Also the images of risk, danger, images of us, them, the racialization of the outside world in a situation of perceived danger, and suddenly I was constructed as being an outsider and dumped out of the police organization. And in my PhD dissertation, I talk in depth about this racialization within the police organization, but I definitely think that these two are related to each other. So yeah, I'm just gonna continue with just a brief scene from the television show Op de Bon. Because earlier I talked about who are the ones carrying the burden of these police powers. And in this, I mean, the first idea is, well, the bad guys, the crooks, the criminals, the deviants. But in this scene, this person is quite explicit about other types of categories that should carry the burden of police work.
Tegen de verkeerscontrole aan en op je gordel niet op. De meeste bestuurders accepteren zonder al te veel gedoe de bekeuring. Alleen er zijn altijd uitzonderingen. Zo liepen wij tegen een man aan die vond dat hij sowieso geen bekeuring hoefde te betalen, omdat hij van adel is.
En hier is hij dan. De man die meent dat hij vanwege zijn adellijke afkomst geen autogordel op hoeft.
Ik woon hier om de hoek, mevrouw. Waarom zit u zo te hinderen? U kunt toch gaan maar zien dat ik geen crimineel ben. En als ik er 1 keer met een riem op, dan ga ik met een kast van wonen met z'n allen in een aardig dorp. Geef elkaar maar terug, dat kan ik niet.
Je hoeft niet te antwoorden, want dan moet je klaar opschrijven voor de gordel.
Ja, ik heb een fles whisky op, mevrouw. Dat ziet u toch?
Ja.
Kijk, u zult in een land waar drugsbendes rondlopen. Jullie niet opgehouden worden voor 10 minuten voor zo'n onzin. Dat begrijpen jullie natuurlijk allemaal. Dan kan je op de televisie aan de mensen vertellen. Dan vindt in Nederland tijdens dat we de oorlogloze hoofden op een rijtje gaan zitten. Ja. En dat het ophoudt met iedereen gelijk maken aan elkaar. Er zijn hier bepaalde grote verschillen in het land. En dat betekent onder andere dat mensen zoals ik niet door mevrouw van de straat gehaald kunnen worden. Dat gebeurde vroeger. Goedemiddag.
I'm just using this perhaps as an exaggeration of my point, but I mean, historically, the police did play a role in reproducing and sustaining class-based divisions in society. I would say this is also the Marxist view of the police organization, in which the police was specifically an institution supposed to protect capital and property, and also higher classes in society against the poor, the marginalized, etc., etc. I will go on to the topic of stop and search, in the United States called stop and frisk. I dubbed it proactieve controle, so it's self-initiated police stop. And what is important here is that this is not just a regular routinous thing. Police officers will talk about it in this way. Just stopping someone 3 minutes, ask them for their idea, they can go about their business. But it is really not. Police officers are a special category of human beings. And I would even go as far as say that they are actually superhumans. And in this next fragment from the horrible movie, Let's Be Cops, 2 guys, they go to a costume party, so they're not cops. They go to a costume party dressed as police officers. When they walk back, they discover the benefits of being a police officer.
That was different. Yeah. Freeze! You guys over there, freeze! Everybody freeze! Carry on. Carry on. I got my eyes on you, Jack. Carry on. You've got to try it. Oh, I'm at stupid pigs. Stay in school. Yep, and it go. So let's speak up.
Okay. I mean, the idea here is that the power to stop someone is, in my eyes, really a superhuman being power, as you just saw. And to put it in terms of more law-based, let's say, framework, it is an infringement on the freedom of mobility of citizens in a free democratic society. I can't stop people on the street. The police can, and it is really important to just underline this huge power of police officers. So more to my topic. So in a vast sea of people, which cues, which indicators do police officers use to stop and search people? So what I did, I mean, around 200 hours of observations in the back of the police car, 59 in-depth interviews, which led to 800 A4 pages, which I didn't transcribe, luckily, but which we had to analyze afterwards. And I mean, because I was working for the police organization, I mean, 1,000 plus informal conversations in which we got the juicy details. Just very briefly, all of this is against, I would say, the far-reaching securitization in society. Briefly, I would say the process in which different domains of society are being understood or looked at through the prism of security. So domains like schools, Luna parks, recreational parks, etc., etc. I just finished a research in a hospital setting. So it was an interesting ethics thing. Just finished a research in a hospital setting on violent, aggressive behavior of patients. And also there you see this, the process of securitization, cameras, security cameras, private security, etc., etc. I would say the other interesting trend is a focus of post-crime to pre-crime. The tragedy of police officers is, I mean, before at least, that they were always late arriving at the crime scene, so to say. But there is also, because of improved technological means, the shift is to pre-crime strategies. And the movie Minority Report comes to mind, in which the police is trying to intervene almost in the future. And I call it, a little bit jokingly, I also call it a form of virtual police work, in which the police really tries to change the future almost. Another example, by the way, of a pre-crime strategy is the use of risk profiles, which is very important in the research on racial profiling. So what we did, so this is the end result of all the analysis. We divided the decision-making process of police officers in 3 phases. And today, I'm basically only going to talk about the first phase, which is the scanning phase. So the 3 phases: scanning, interaction, results. And the scanning phase is about the police officer just walking around, driving around, taxating, valuing, categorizing his social surrounding, her social surrounding, and trying to make meaning of it. So it's basically the meaning-making process of police officers in daily police work. And the first selection procedure, so to say, that's a very neutral way of talking about it, is what is also a very dominant perspective in police research literature, is so-called incongruences, out of placeness. So the idea is that police officers have normative ideas about neighborhoods, and once people don't fit in that location, they draw the attention of the police officer. But what we did is we broadened this idea of out of places to more generally incongruences, and there are a number of incongruences. By the way, I don't know why I'm clicking here. I have this thing. So I'm just gonna give examples of the first one, the green line. It's the incongruence of a person, vehicle, and the most prominent one was young guys in expensive cars. The police officer wondered, how is it possible that these young kids are driving in these cars? So onto the blue line. This was the out of place perspective. And the most prominent finding here was an ethnic minority youngster in especially white privileged neighborhoods of Amsterdam. The third one, vehicle, time, place, expensive car in low status neighborhoods, but also the other way around. And the last one, behavior, place. Basically, all normative interruptions are cues for police officers to be alert. So once someone is screaming on the street, which is, you could say, a transgression of a social norm, this is something for a police officer to be alert, to be on the lookout. At least they will be attentive. What we did was we tested the hypothesis of out of placeness, in which I think minorities were out of place in white rich neighborhoods. So we turned it around, and we went to the ethnically heterogeneous neighborhoods. So, for instance, Amsterdam, the south of Amsterdam, with large population of Surinamese and Antillean people. We went to Amsterdam West, a lot of Turkish and Moroccan people. So, out of place, the incongruence based on person, time, space would say that white people would draw attention in those neighborhoods. We didn't find that. Actually, in these neighborhoods, police officers shifted to a demographic logic, and they were saying, look around. There are only Moroccan and Turkish people here. Who are we going to stop and search here? Obviously, we're going to stop them. However, in the richer white neighborhoods, they were saying, but we are stopping these Moroccan kids because they don't live here. So, I mean, in some, Moroccan Dutch youngster, and I have to say, I will talk about that later. Also, cues of clothing are important here. So hoodies, driving on a scooter with someone on the back of the scooter were also relevant. But these youngsters had the chance of being stopped in the neighborhoods where they were living, but also in the neighborhoods where they were not. So there was something up. We have to, I would say, complement this idea of police officers just being on the lookout of normative interruptions. And I want to introduce a second perspective, again, a short clip from the movie Lola Rent. And in this scene, the idea is that Lola is supposed to find a lot of money in 20 minutes, and if not, her beloved boyfriend will get killed. So in pure panic, she decides to rob the bank of her father, with which she has a bad relationship. So, apparently Lola doesn't fit the suspect description of someone which would rob a bank. And I thought I would just use this as some sort of comic relief, but police officers started to give me examples in which something similar to this actually happened. And just to add in, I mean, organized crime is very much aware of the way the police works. So they are adapting constantly to, I would say, very routinous activities of, especially, I'm not talking about specialized divisions of the police, but street level police work, yes. So moving on to the second perspective, which I call police officer as a Where's Wally searcher. And just to add in, police literature has a more mature way of talking about it. They call it rounding up the usual suspects. For those who don't know Where's Wally, Where's Waldo, it's a A3 book. It's a large book with cartoons, drawings for children. As a child, I did all the Where's Wally's. And the idea, the purpose is to look for Wally on these drawings. And Wally always looks the same. He has blue pants, he has this sweater, shoes. So always the same suspect description. And my argument is that the police works in the same ways. That they have, sure, they work in very subtle, situational, contextualized ways, but also in the contextualized ways, they have ideas about who is the crook, who is the deviant. So they work in this way as well as my argument. It's actually not very easy to find Wally.
Somehow my jaw's hurting. I always saw it at the dentist at the ceiling.
Sorry?
When I see that picture, my jaw's hurting. I always saw it at the dentist at the ceiling. You're lying there, being a Wally.
Okay, interesting call.
Yeah, very.
Just taking back these four categories, which we discussed earlier: person, vehicle, behavior, time, place. When we go, let's say, an analytical level lower, you have the specifications of these categories. So, for instance, person, biological body, cultural body, disobedient body. These are like police property, they call it also. So people who are already stigmatized with police information, they form like a reservoir of potential suspects. Vehicle, old, expensive, lease, rent, foreign license plate, walking, riding, looking, etc., etc. What I want to do now is, too bad. I just want to, this is a literal transcription from one of the interviews. And it was going to show up line by line, but I assume you can read. So maybe we can just do that. And my question is, which cues do you recognize in this transcription? Thinking from both perspective of the police officer as a Where's Wally searcher and the incongruous perspective.
Can you move a little to
Oh, sorry. Anyone just shout? No one?
License plate.
Yeah, license plate, definitely.
Shabby, polished,
Yeah,
rich.
Very old car, yeah. And incongruence.
They don't drive there often.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we are about there. So this would be like just here the codes. Two Polish men, and the license plate is used to identify the people. And this happened in quite a lot of instances actually. So the cultural body, these guys were a bit shabby on that side, the incongruence perspective. And here again, it is repeated. That does not belong here. Let's just check it out. And just to underline, there is no suspicious behavior in this situation at all. There is no individualized suspicious behavior by these guys. I'm going to move on to the motivation, the explanation for this officer for stopping these two guys. I'm going to read it this time. You have an area, the Zwanenlaan Avenue, and people with money live there. And actually, right opposite of it, we have a street with public housing on one side and owner-occupied houses on the other side. You see it actually in all of Eiburg that public housing and owner-occupied homes sit together. So you see throughout Eiburg that different cultures collide. On one part of the street, people have nice, expensive bicycles in front of their houses, and on the other side of the road, steals them, to put it like that. So I will come back to the, I would say also the class-based divisions in this explanation of the police officer. Moving on to the second example. Look, in that expensive street, in that really expensive street, a shabby car was driving, a Toyota Starlet with a Moroccan in it. That car will be stopped. Why? In that street, there are no Moroccans and Toyota Starlets. They don't live there. It's such an expensive neighborhood. What are you doing over there? You cannot get lost there either. So if you drive there, you drive there because you're there on purpose, because it's not a main road. So this guy goes to the side. And then it turns out that he has criminal records for drugs, which made me think he was driving cocaine around. He's in an expensive neighborhood where many yuppies live who go out and everything. So we observed that there are lots of little drug runners in our neighborhood. Well, I have not found anything on it though. So again, which cues do you recognize here? Yeah, car again, old car. Expensive neighborhood, yeah. So again, here, high socioeconomic status, old car, a Moroccan, with a Moroccan. I just want to stop here for a bit, because earlier I said that the license plate was used as a means of identifying the person within the car. I mean, I could be driving in a car with a Polish license plate, but anyway. The officer here does not know at all that this person is Moroccan. He only could have known, maybe in a second instance, when he actually stopped the person, asked for his ID, and perhaps on the basis of his name, he could derive that he has Moroccan descent. So this is, in my eyes, a clear-cut example of racialization. This is really about evaluation of the physical body of citizens. And it is in that way, it is irrelevant whether this person is truly Moroccan. Because based on this, I would say, norm image, the physical norm image, people who fit that idea of police officers will be stopped. So we actually interviewed white autochthonous police officers who were being stopped by their colleagues because they apparently looked like Moroccans. There were also a lot of Turkish youngsters who were stopped by the police because they were apparently looking like Moroccan, whatever that may be. So I would say that the police has a methodological problem here in trying to identify who is a Moroccan or not. And what is more important, in both examples, you see that divisions of us, them, privileged, marginalized, is a very important part in the deciding on who to stop and search. And I would also say that this goes much further than just mere crime reduction and crime prevention. In my opinion, proactive police work is a form of spatialized exclusion, in which the police is actually cleaning, purifying these areas, certain areas in cities, of especially privileged white neighborhoods, from the marginalized and non-white bodies. And this exclusion is not absolute, but these guys who are in these neighborhoods are effectively hindered and discouraged from being in these neighborhoods because they're being hindered in their mobility, in their freedom to move around the city. So I think it would be reducing police work to just crime reduction and crime prevention is, when you look at these two empirical cases, just that, a reduction of the complexity of also the other purposes of proactive police work. I know I've got still a lot more to say, but I want to point out to another trend in policing in the field of securitization, and that is the so-called responsibilization, horizontalization in the field of security issues. So citizens are being made responsible for safety and security issues in their local communities. And here you see a leaflet from the police in which they target dog owners who are asked to be on the lookout for people who don't fit in their neighborhood. So it's basically, again, this incongruence thinking. And yes, I think it's a good trend that citizens are being made responsible for local safety security. But I also think that it comes with risks. And I just want to point out the possibility in which the state can actually become an instrument in the hands of privileged groups with more social, cultural capital in society. I just want to illustrate that with a brief scene from the documentary Zwart. And they just did, I mean, it's not scientific, but they did a situation test in which 3 guys are trying to steal a bike.
Lengte, leeftijd en kleding is hetzelfde. Alleen hun etniciteit verschilt. Wat voor soort jongen was het?
Ik denk gevaar.
Vond u hem verdacht eruit?
Nee.
Wat dacht je?
Niks.
Je dacht niks?
Ja, het is zelfspijtig. Dat is mijn losse gebeurd.
Maar waarom zei u niks?
Omdat hij zo rustig was. Nou, dat deed me wel. Want hij ook vader zou kunnen zijn. Hij zag gewoon netjes uit, zoals ik ook bij zou doen. Dat zou mij ook kunnen gebeuren.
Ja.
Sorry?
Is dit iets van jou?
Wat is het? Goedendag. Ja, zeker. Klopt niet. Sorry?
Is het jouw fiets?
Wat dan? Daar staat dus iemand, een heer, een damefiets met een kinderzitje gaat jatten. Ja, wat is het verhaal?
Waarom maakt u foto's?
Oh, ik kan het altijd nog een keer opzoeken met de politie of zo. Denk ik, op deze manier is bezig. Ik dacht even, ik ga er wat van zeggen. Maar toen dacht ik, ja, gewoon, straks een klap op mijn hoofd met die grote nek daar.
Ik dacht, waarom doet iemand iets? Maar ik dacht ook, ik ga er zelf niets van zeggen als ik weet. Dus voor mij wat aan.
Ik denk dat we daar dat komt. Ja.
Nadat onze fietsdieven alle 3,5 uur bezig zijn geweest, kan je stellen dat de meeste mensen zich identificeren met de witte jongen, terwijl ze de donkere jongens verdacht of zelfs gevaarlijk vinden en daarom vaak de politie bellen. Bovendien wordt de witte jongen zelfs geholpen. Tot 2 keer toe.
Ja.
Zijn persoon is onschuld niet te bewijzen. Je bent in principe oké, totdat het tegendeel bewezen is. Dit voordeel wordt ook wel wit privilege genoemd.
Yeah. Any reactions, perhaps, on this? No? Yeah, it's a documentary via Sunny Bergman. Sorry, was good about Black Pete. What I want to demonstrate here is especially, and there are many instances in which this happens. There was actually a recent case in Amos in which 2 Moroccan Dutch guys, apparently Amos is in the south of the Netherlands, 2 Moroccan Dutch guys were driving in a yellow sports car, and a group of farmers on tractors, a WhatsApp group of farmers, drove these guys off the streets and called the police. So these guys were, so to say, taken hostage for a while. And the idea was that they obviously didn't belong in the local majority white community, but the farmers thought that they might be there to steal sheep in a yellow sports car. Yeah, it's unbelievable. This example it leads to more frequent contact between ethnic minorities and the police, but I don't think it's a clear-cut example of ethnic racial profiling. And I think I think this is really important, and that there should be more research on the actual influence of reports and calls of citizens, which lead to biased policing, basically, and disproportionate targeting of ethnic minorities because of the role citizens themselves have. I'm going to skip this. This is the interaction phase. This is in which I talk about the results of proactive police work, and just to say, international research shows that only in approximately roughly 1 out of 10 cases, proactive police work, a stop and search, leads to a hit, which can be a fine or just an arrest by finding a weapon or drugs. Roughly in 1 out of 10 cases. So in 9 out of 10 cases, this police work is being targeted against law-abiding citizens. It's being targeting people who are not being involved in crime. I think it's safe to assume that. And it is not so weird that this form of policing does not lead to arrests. Why? Because in many cases, there is no suspicious behavior. There is a complete lack of suspicious behavior. And it's just based on these normative interruptions, so to say, that police officers are being triggered and that they decide to interact with people. I mean, this is just I would say the whole decision-making process of police officers. But just to go to a conclusion, I think these two trends, on the one hand securitization, but at the other hand the culturalization of citizenship, in which just having the necessary papers is for a long time not enough, but to become a true citizen, there is a whole body, there are different cultural normative criteria which you should meet to be perceived as belonging to Dutch society. And I think that the coming together of these two trends also impacts on the way police officers are going about their jobs. I already mentioned that reducing proactive police work to just crime reduction is really very limited conceptually, but also empirically, because police officers in many instances are involved in tasks which have nothing to do with being on the lookout for criminals. But it's more about maintaining social order, and also about doing that, they are reproducing the existing inequalities in society, and they're reproducing the already existing inequalities in terms of marginalized and privileged groups. And historically, these lines were more class-based. It was about the vagabond, about the poor, the marginalized. But I would say that currently, these class-based divisions are intersecting with ethnicity and race. There are a lot more cues. It's also gendered. It's especially about males, about young males. But there is in the Dutch discourse, the marginalized, economically marginalized, ethnic migrant man is being constructed as a threat to Dutch society. And the police, through this proactive stops, is reproducing these existing inequalities. Bigot talks about the Frenchman, Bigot, he talks about the continuum of risk, in which at the one hand you have the cultural other, at the other hand crime. And the problematization of the cultural other is, the focus is on culture, on their own cultures, which is being seen as hindering their integration. And we had for a long time the problematization of, for instance, Moroccan culture, finding for explanations for their deviance and overrepresentation by this focus on culture. And I mean, just to step away from it, I think that the current discourse on terrorism is making use of the already existing infrastructure which we had, the discursive infrastructure, in which now there's the governance of diversity through all this policy attention to radicalization. I mean, radicalization is now the hip term, also if you want to get research funding, etc., etc. But in policy domain, the focus is on radicalization. So if here, the career of a culture other was through culture becoming a possible criminal, now the terrorists might become, so the cultural other might become a terrorist through the process of radicalization, and the focus is shifted to Islam. And I'm really rounding it up now. So the whole product of police work, I am seeing it against this background in which culture has become aligned with crime. Also important, I have not really mentioned it, but this idea of revanchism is really important. So the impression that the state has lost control in especially marginalized communities, and to win back these neighborhoods, there is more repressive policing in these neighborhoods, which also intersect with ethnicity and race. And the last one, because of this shift from post-crime to pre-crime policing strategies, there's also a shift from individual suspects to suspicious communities. So it's not so much about the concrete individual from the traditional law perspective who is committing a crime and then the police is focusing attention on that. No, because the police wants to intervene in the future, it identifies suspect communities, and the ones who have these bodily cues in terms of class, race, ethnicity, etc., become the targets of policing. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Then the floor is yours. We can hear you, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to start by thanking everyone there, and especially Sinan for the wonderful talk and for being open to experimentation with the technology here. I'm having fun figuring this out. I have some thoughts that I think I've organized, but I have to admit I was kind of listening and thinking at the same time. So I'll go through my thoughts, and hopefully then I think we'll open it maybe to the rest of the room for conversation. But my thoughts focus, I think, on three main, I don't know if you want to call them poles because there's three of them, but three main foci. The first focus is I want to think about relationships in a second. Next I want to think about reason and research. And then I want to think a little bit about critique. Because actually listening to this talk made me think about all those in new ways, I think. So first I want to start just by saying how much I enjoyed hearing about the research, because I think there's such a need for empirical, concrete studies of police that are kind of not abstracted in the way that so much kind of quantitative criminology tends to be. And that's not used necessarily as kind of empty political polemic. That is a real exploration of what policing is and can be. Which is, again, as we'll see, I'll talk a little bit more about, when I say not political polemic, it doesn't mean evacuated of critique. Because I think there's a very important and strong critique here that I want to focus on. But first, relationships. And one of the things that was really highlighted to me in this talk was that police itself is a relationship. And that anthropological approaches to police are a really useful way to highlight that fact. And just as an example, I'd maybe like to hear a little bit more in the conversation, since I don't speak any Dutch, what the preposition one uses when doing research like this. Because I noticed that I think the preposition Sinan used was work with the police. And prepositions are tricky words because they're small and they often are overlooked, but they describe relationships. And I think there's a really important difference to explore between working with, working for, working on, or maybe even other prepositions. My own research in France, chez, is a different type of relationship. I'm not sure if Sinan would call what he did working chez la police. But it's something to think about because from its inception, our own research, not only is police a relationship, but our own relationship as researchers to police is part of that web. And I just want to think a little bit more about that in terms of, so there's a set of relationships that kind of started us out with in terms of insider, outsider, police, citizen, included, excluded, protection versus threat, right? it's interesting to me that in a lot of examples that Sinan showed us, the social bond itself rests on that relationship, on a certain kind of relationship that itself is understood to have kind of prerequisite responsibilities. So that there was the first video clip there about stopping the aristocrat, who gets very worked up about getting a ticket. The caption starts by saying most people will just stop and pay. Right? So there's a normative expectation for what happens in those kinds of relationships, and that relationship is then highlighted when that normativity is violated. Right? But what's interesting to me also is that in resistance to that police stop, the aristocrat himself then also invokes a certain type of normative person. So that every sane person knows what's happening in this country. He says, speaking to the camera, speaking to a faceless mediated public, right, that is not present, but is in some sense constituted by their sanity. And their sanity understood in a certain kind of way. That the public is kind of reason itself, right? I'm speaking to the reasonable. Right? It says that aristocrat, right? So that I guess to backtrack a little bit here, when I say police is a relationship, police is not an essential legal definition. Police is not a substantive material possession. It's an interaction. And what that means for us as researchers of police is we have to think carefully about what kinds of things we're bringing into the relationship, what kinds of interactions we are constituting in our study of what we are calling police. Now, in that vein, I found it super interesting the kinds of things that Sinan brings into this talk, right? From that original video of the aristocrat being stopped, to a video clip of Let's Be Cops, which I want to hopefully get to a little bit in a second, to Run Lola Run, to his own transcripts, to I guess it's called Where's Wally, in the American version it's Where's Waldo. I don't know why the translation there. To again that field documentary about the kind of the ways people kind of react in a racial way towards people unlocking their bike. I found it super interesting the kinds of things that were brought into relation there. Because in one sense, the geography of that popular culture works in really interesting tension to the national politics of cultural citizenship, right? Because we go from aristocratic, I believe it was aristocratic Netherlands to Hollywood to Germany to the streets of Amsterdam and back in ways that really speak in productive tension with each other. For one, I mean, to think about, let's know about that clip was the way that the amount of police power is emphasized in that clip. That people will, with a very word, people will stop, and that kind of almost absolute power. But also, and I have to admit I have not seen the film. I've seen the clips of the film, but I also understand that one of if a film like that could be said to have an argument, one of the arguments of the film is that police, if police is a massive power, that power is at base performative, right? Those two schmucks put on a uniform and all of a sudden they can enact that kind of power to stop people on the street. So again, police is a performative, not an essential, substantive, or structural kind of power. Now, I think we need to pause over that claim of that film a little bit, and I think Sinan's work is pausing over that because I'm not sure that's actually true. Number one. So again, going all over the place a little bit. So police is a relationship, and our research itself is constituting that set of, is in some sense constructing those relationships in what we choose to bring into relation to each other in what we talk about police, and in how we imagine those relationships. Again, working on, for, with, about, against, Shay, all kind of are not just describing politics, but are kind of political choices in them, not just descriptions of politics, but political acts. Now, having said that, I want to think about specifically the kind of politics of what Sinan is trying to point out to us here. And as I understand it, there's kind of two strains of critique of the police, the two kind of political interventions that I'm reading. One, a kind of rejection of a certain kind of assertion by police to justify their policing interventions in terms of incongruence theory, and that they're just looking for things out of place, right? So the argument there is, again, they're arguing that they're policing certain kinds of non-normative relationships. We're not regulating bodies per se, but bodies in certain kinds of spaces that they don't belong, or acts. We're not regulating acts per se, but certain kinds of acts in certain kinds of contexts, which then highlight certain kinds of risks. Is their argument, right? But part of what Sinan shows is that reason shifts depending on context, right? So different forms of reason, different forms of rationality are emphasized in different kinds of spaces, right? So if in one space it's incongruence theory, in another space it's demographic theory, right? How could we not stop Turks in this neighborhood because everyone's Turks, right? So that kind of assertion of a certain kind of reason is really a mask for what Sinan is really trying to point out, which is the real unifying rationality behind police action, as Sinan is seeing it, is racialization. So that the linking, what relates these police actions from context to context is not the reason that they are asserting, but a different kind of reason. There's a different kind of link that unify these actions, and that's race. That police are acting according to assumptions and beliefs about bodies and certain kinds of bodies, right? And that's what really unites those kinds of actions. Now, that's especially problematic in terms of what Sinan brings up is kind of cultural citizenship. In that cultural citizenship, in this reading, is really racial citizenship. In that culture is a stand-in for race, in the way police talk about culture in this context, right? Which is a really important, I think, critique of the use of culture as a political tool, and a reminder that we need to be wary of it, especially as anthropologists, as a term that explains anything. It could be a term to be looked into, but not really to explain very much. But also the very what's the word I want to use? I want to use the word troubling. The troubling purification. Right? If there's a linking if this is a racial logic that unites the kinds of police action that Sinan is showing us, okay? It's also a logic of, it's pure reason. It's a pure racial reason, right? In that it's a reason that is, again, in Sinan's own terms, that's a form of spatialized exclusion that is also kind of purification. There are no hiccups. There are no non-normative spaces, bodies, or relationships allowed in this space. Okay? Which actually makes me think about something else. In that final clip, again with the bike, again, maybe this makes more sense again, I think that was in Dutch, but maybe it makes more sense. For the people who are explaining why they didn't intervene in the white guy, a couple of people, more than one for sure, maybe even several, said something like, he looked like a dad, right? Which is, again, it's a way to talk not about his skin, it's a way not to talk about his essence, but a way to talk about the types of relationships he can be imagined as having. Now, the race, it's a proxy way to talk about race in this context, right? But it also talks about, again, the politics of, it points to the politics of relation. Again, thinking about kind of my own research, the non-white is literally unimaginable as relatable. They're estranged, étranger, right? They are not part of a kinship structure that can be recognized as related to oneself, right? And which is, in an important way, and I think Sinan is pointing, part of how kind of the politics of cultural citizenship works through policing, right? So I think that's important to think about, but especially as kind of we move on to more work in policing. I think the politics of the relationship in policing is super important for what we think we're studying when we talk about studying police. What kinds of things are, and who is brought into the conversation? So there's dudes in uniforms, for sure, and we ride around in their cars with them, and we interview them and we watch what they do. But in some ways, that's not the most, that's interesting and important. So I want to say it's not interesting. But what's interesting is what other kinds of things we bring in tension with those dudes in uniform. And part of what I think I'm hearing from Sinan, and if I want to hear maybe more about, is I feel as if there are voices and perspectives and insights that are motivating Sinan's critique that are not made explicit in this analysis. So it's therefore not kind of, in an important way, not made into an explicit relationship in the research. Right? So I actually want to hear a little bit more about that. I would hope from Sinan. And I guess for the group, if I could, maybe start to open it up to a larger conversation, I'd like to think about how we could take some of these insights, police as a relationship, and research design as constructing relationships, right? How we can think about that research design as a form of political critique in our own research. With that, I think my thoughts are exhausted for now. I guess I'll open it up to the floor or to some other moderator.
Yeah. Do you want to respond first to a couple of these things that have been addressed and then open up the floor, or? I mean, maybe open the floor first, and I will just turn the screen up so that you can actually see the group. Oh shit. Yeah. Whose computer is this? Uh-oh. Oh shit. What did I do?
It seems to be working.
Yeah, so we only see you on it, but that's okay, right? Or do you want them on screen?
It's okay.
Yeah? Okay. Who wants to respond first?
I have a response also to the first talk. Can I do it from?
Yeah.
It was very elucidating, specializing in anthropology of police, but in philosophy, and I am also confused about something. Maybe you or both can try to clarify that, because at the beginning of your talk you were speaking about the normative dimension of policing. I know that the emphasis is here on empirical research. And then you said that something like that police has always been there to defend the privileges of the higher class. In reference to Marxist theory. Well, as a philosopher, I would immediately say, well, that might be true, but that would, of course, not be a normative argument, or at least it would not be a proper normative argument. I would say that the normative defense of police in general would be that the state must have a monopoly on violence, and that the monopoly of violence can be defended to the extent that violence is natural and we cannot wipe it out. So there is existing violence, and the only thing we can do is to monopolize it. So here lies a normative defense for policing. And of course there can be many problems, as you already expressed, in your topic, in how precisely this violence is enacted. So my first question is, does this difference that I now introduced make sense to you, that there is a normative idea of police that can be criticized as on the basis of your empirical research, like not doing what they ought to do, or, but you also suggest later, they're doing exactly what they have always done and always do, so we actually have to develop a critique of policing in general. The second question, that was also on the movie in the Vondelpark, I think, on the where you saw very clear racist behavior of almost all people. For me, but there's also a question. I would relate it to the problem that we have of developing citizenship that is compatible with living in a multicultural society. I think this kind of obvious racist behavior is an example of uncivilized behavior, and has to do with the lack of civilization, which is, I think, perhaps also the fact that we have not yet developed kind of institutions that help us to have a better consciousness of that. So, do you see in the relation of this to problem of policing, which I think is a different problem, like creation of good citizens and the role of police, do you think that there is a need for, or would you say there is also a need for making police profiling more, or the profiling that's done by the leadership? Are there possibilities of making it more civilized? Do you think, in more general, it's a problem of civilization, as I just sketched it? So, yeah.
Yeah. I would just collecting remarks and questions, then we can one or two more, and then a general discussion, or yeah. Is that okay, Kevin?
One more time?
What?
I didn't quite hear that.
Okay, so we collect just one or two more questions and remarks, and then so what?
Yeah, to Sinan, I was wondering whether you have read the book Policing the Crisis. It's written by Stuart Hall and School of Cultural Studies in the UK, in Birmingham. And they deal with amongst others, statistics, the relationship with the police and marginalized neighborhoods, the way the press responds to that, and the way politicians respond to that. But they look at the entire chain. And what I'm wondering, why I'm saying this, is that the curious situation in the Netherlands is that an entire political movement emerged that sought to portray crime as a kind of a, the collapse of Dutch cultural order. And that movement emerged right at the time that crime figures were actually going down. Crime statistics were going down. So you had Rita Verdonk, or you had like hardliners on the right appearing at just that moment, and the switch in Dutch politics appearing in just that moment. And Stuart Hall and the people that wrote that book used this notion of a moral panic to describe kind of a selective focus on certain minorities as a threat to the social order. But there is not this kind of mismatch between rising crime figures and the rise of let's say, the law and order figures. Because in the UK it already happened in the 80s. In the Netherlands you have it happening in 2002 when crime figures go down. So I was wondering whether you could comment on that kind of strange paradox.
I have one more. I have one more remark that connects to Kevin's remarks on types of relationships in policing and understanding police and police research as from that perspective of relationships. When you showed an example of that guy, Moroccan Dutch guy, walking around in a rich neighborhood where a lot of cocaine is sold, right? That's one of the examples that you give. This made me think of one of the key texts in police anthropology, which is a book by John and Jean Kammerer called Law and Disorder in the Post-Colony. And they're actually addressing the importance of understanding relationships in policing and in the field of policing by, for instance, making a global comparison between the North and the South, talking, for instance, about corruption in the global South, that this is always necessarily in the globalized world a North-South relationship. Well, they give an example of bribes, that when we focus on corruption in, say, Brazil or, say, Cambodia or whatever, the focus is on those who receive bribes, not on those who give them, who are often the multinational operating in the global North. Well, just using that framework on North-South global relationships in the field of policing to that very specific occasion there in Amsterdam, where one guy is suspect of smuggling drugs, cocaine to that neighborhood, and all the attention, all the police attention going to that guy who supplies, not those who demand the drugs. Maybe this is the kind of analytical framework that is offered to us by John and Jean Kammerer in that book, that we can use to think about the notion of relationships in policing. Not a question, just a remark. You want to respond first?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. You.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm just gonna start with the. I really like the idea about seeing police work through this lens of relationships, and that policing is very much about the interaction, performativity of police work. So not just talk, but also what police officers really do. But I also think that there is a clear relationship between the two. Your comment about my own relationship to the topic really triggers me, and I do think that mean, my starting point is that there is obviously no such thing as a neutral, objective academic endeavor, and that academia is also very much should be understood in a context of power, etc. So I agree very much that doing research, just by the act of doing research, you are intervening in the empirical realities that you are researching. And that it's not just mere description, but by describing it, you're already altering that reality. So I do definitely agree with you on the complex relationship you have as a researcher within the field. And then perhaps to say a bit more about my own relationship to the police organization. Well, I grew up myself in marginalized neighborhoods in which the police was disproportionately targeting these areas. And I could have never imagined that years later I was actually going to work for a police organization. But I am describing all of this very explicitly in my research. I talk about this in my dissertation, talk about this a bit less in this last research, but I'm very explicit about my own role on the research process. And that I mean, in the beginning, when I entered this, what I call the police land, I had my own stereotypes. I mean, these were just stereotypes. Just as police is in many ways biased, I came in with my own set of stereotypes. I have to say that just by, I mean, also, I think one of the tasks of anthropologists to understand the point of view of the actors themselves. You use the words working with, on, etc. I think that in the beginning stages, I was particularly doing this. I was trying to understand the world of police officers. I was trying to look through their eyes to the social world. But I have to say that over time, you take different perspectives. Your own perspective shifts as well. This is also because you just put your findings in, let's say, different frameworks to make sense of what you saw. So I took distance and later, when I was not working for the police organization anymore, I also started being more critical towards policing practice. For instance, from a human rights perspective, and seeing both the benefits of police work, but also the paradoxical and possible negative, threatening outcomes of police work. So I would say that over time, my positioning, my attitude shifted. So from working with, being understanding, getting a grasp of the meaning-making processes of police officers, the very empirical reality, to over time taking a more critical attitude to actually police work.
Can I add something to that? I mean, the relationship that we as police scholars have with police is indeed a relationship and thus decided by two parties. I mean, I think we can agree, Sinan and I, that once we started to become more critical of police and started to focus on human rights, and started to focus on racial profiling, etc., we both kind of got excommunicated, right? So talking about relationship that we have with police as a very powerful institute is also talking about and thinking strategically about what we want to do on the long term when we operate as police powers. If I look at myself, I am quite sure that for the next 5 years I won't do anything because they won't let me. So, I mean, this is something that we need to take into account already. Talking about research design as a political intervention, thinking about the long-term consequences of what we do, and that relationship is decided by two parties.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours about the very difficult law-based relationship over the last 10 years I had. I was engaged with police organization. And frankly, the word I always choose to describe my position is that I'm like a critical friend, in which both comes together because of having these experiences with street level police work, I also have a lot of empathy to the serious, very serious, difficult, stressful situations police officers encounter on a daily basis. But it's doing this double movement of being close and taking distance, being critical and being that loving friend. So that's how I would describe my relationship to the police organization. Yeah, I understand your point about the confusion. Because I was saying it right after each other. I was making the comment about the normative aspects of policing, but I was saying it in a more general way of the distribution of goods, services, and also distributing, let's say, almost feelings of security among society in general. That was one aspect. The second one was the more historical approach. So normativity is not really related to that. And there, yes, I do agree with you that I would take the position is that they are still doing what they were doing in the past, but the way it's ordered is shifting. There's, let's say, roughly, first it was more class-based, to now also with different additional intersections in which race is playing also a more important role. To a large degree, I think that also has to do with the fact that marginalized groups, but also from a class perspective, right now are ethnic minorities in many Western European societies. So that would be my position I would take. They're actually still doing, that they're still reproducing what the historical beginnings of the police institute was.
But that's a conflict, right? Because the state should take care of all citizens and not exclude certain groups. Yeah. That's what the European police is doing. Yeah. So how do you see this conflict?
As exactly the ways you describe. There's definitely a conflict there, and you know, whatever I try and make of it, my position is that the police is not neutral. So that is my main relationship to the police organization. I started from that assumption, axiom. Police is not neutral. So yeah, there is definitely a conflict there. If you ask me what is the way out, normatively, I do not have a clear answer to that question. No, I don't have a clear answer to let's say a way out of solving this issue. To maybe move on to, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and ideas, obviously. To move on to Marianne's point, policing the crisis.
I do very much like the idea of moral panics, that it does not necessarily need a factual relationship to say what is actually going on, but that it's more about speech acts and actors that create, construct, sustain a problem, and that have a stake in creating this problem. And it's actually very good, and I think I should use this concept more in my description of as a background explanation for what the police officers are doing in micro situations. It is very much to do with the creation of a moral panic, in which the marginalized ethnic male migrants is seen as a threat to Dutch society, to social order, to economic, social, cultural relationships in the Netherlands. And for years, we problematized culture in different domains of society and in relation to crime. For years, we are problematizing the overrepresentation of Marokcan and Antillean Dutch youngsters. Instead of talking about different representations of why that is happening, also it's the institutions related to the government keep producing these kinds of statistics, these ethnicized, racialized statistics, and we will now be shown other ways of imagining these statistics. So I agree very much with you. I take it as a suggestion to make use of this notion in a background explanation of what's actually happening. Yeah.
You can take one more.
Well, can I add a little something to that? I think one, just to be clear, what I was asking, what I was pointing to when I said I think there's an implicit community of critique in your work. I mean, one way to incorporate that could be kind of the confessional autobiographical life history of the researcher, which I think could be a useful way into that. But I wasn't necessarily calling for that. What I was just suggesting was I could hear like a tradition of critique there that was forceful and shaping the analysis, but was not made an explicit actor in the conversation, which I thought, again, one way to be would talk about your own kind of experience with with police autobiographically, but I also think it would just be interesting to kind of, when talking about police, make some of those voices who might not be kind of certified doctorate holders, but still people who are thinking deeply and critically about police. And in that way, raising them to the kind of the explicit level of the analysis and the research elevates them as kind of their political philosophers in their own right. I think doing that is interesting for two ways. One, on just a pure kind of inclusive way. Like there's this debate over what the term public criminology means. And one kind of corner of that debate on what public criminology means is kind of this criminologist, sociologist, Ian Loader says, well, what public criminology needs to be is criminology that's not tied to kind of, not beholden to political interests, but kind of more kind of detached, academic, reasonable kind of approach. And then another kind of pole in that debate is a woman named Emma Bell, who says that kind of detached academic kind of voice is all great, but also we need to think about who's kind of at the table for talking about criminology. And, you know, for example, you know, she argues that we need to include kind of more, you know, formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated individuals when we talk about kind of the criminology of incarceration, right? So there's kind of that level of just, it's interesting to include different people as political philosophers or political scientists when we talk about police. But also, I think what your work specifically is showing is that if you were to do that, the whole debate about citizenship would be completely turned on its head in the Netherlands. Because what I think the echoes of that critique that I'm hearing, that is not who's saying it and where it's coming from, and it's in some way coming out of your mouth, but some ways also pointing to something larger, is really fundamentally a classic, almost conservative, I don't want to say conservative, but it's a liberal, enlightened kind of critique of police, right? That their use of reason is not consistent and adequate, that citizenship should be based on an individual's merits, not on kind of membership in a group, that violence that is kind of unrestrained by reason is illegitimate. That's, I mean, Kant. And so this debate about kind of it actually speaks to some other the questions about kind of the debates about citizenship and violence and civilization, right? To this debate about kind of we need to civilize and treat these radical communities how to be more kind of how to be citizens. It's flipped, right? It's police that are inadequately kind of adhering to the values and forms of kind of liberal democracy. And it's the people being policed who are demanding liberal democracy and who understand citizenship in a deeper way, right? And I think that's highlighted, I think that's there in your work, and I think it would be highlighted by elevating not just the guys in uniform as reflecting on their work, but all the different kind of actors who are reflecting on police work. Does that make more sense?
Yep, that's brilliant. Right? Yes.
We have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because we're already in this room for 2.5 hours, and I presume you have to go to work as well. We have one more question in the back. Shall we have that one and then call it a day? For us, at least.
Yes, I am Brian from Hulstein. I'm over in another building normally, and I can visit. I'm very pleased to be here. This will be a hit and run because I have to catch a train. So let's see if there's policing over here. What I really like about your research is that it's critical and it shows patterns instead of just anecdotes. We can all get the anecdotes and see nice fragments of television, which you also have. But the patterns, of course, are very interesting. To help the police think about alternative ways, I would really find it interesting. If it's in your data, I don't know. What other kinds of patterns there are. If there are examples of people trying not to do what we do not want them to do, struggle, perhaps it's partly that they're just caught in these are the ways in which they know how to work, or that show some lines of, okay, I get through the day, and if I have 2 hours to spend, let's do it like that. So perhaps it's in the data, perhaps you can find it there, even if it's weak signals, if you make them a bit stronger in articles or in discussions or anywhere. And that might also be helpful and interesting.
Yeah. No, that's a really good comment. I think that there is actually also a pattern in, let's say, the good practices, the best practices of police officers. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that that category of police officers is looking for individualized suspicion. So they really need suspicious behavior. And even suspicious behavior is a vague, fuzzy category. But
there at least they have this built-in mechanism in which they constantly, reflexively ask themselves, is what I'm seeing, is there maybe an alternative explanation for this behavior, this person being here, etc., etc. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind, that they are
including their self-doubt. So they're not just secure, they're doubting what they see as well.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it's, I would say, a category of reflexive police officers who include this doubt, who are constantly questioning themselves and thinking about other alternative explanation scenarios for the thing that they're seeing. Because just my last comment, what really strikes me is that when this kind of stops don't amount to a concrete hit, whether it's a fine or an arrest or whatever, the majority of police officers, it doesn't lead to changing or altering their ideas or impressions. So that's really something that I can't get my head around it. There, a large category is refusing to give up these. But this
is one of the problems at the Dutch police, at least. I mean, I've been studying them as well, and you cannot seek for solutions in the acrobatics of willpower, of people willing to change their own mindset. They've tried that for years, and it doesn't work. So that kind of liberalized or individualized interventions are simply not enough.
True.
Right? So, but that makes it particularly difficult. I mean, if I look at anthropologists worldwide, if I look at the work, I think you know them as well, Kevin, Graham, Daniel Willis, working in Brazil. If I look at the work of Alice Goffman in the US, their analysis never point to the defect in the character of the police officer, but they point to structural systematic problems. And it's there where we run into difficulties. That's why you ran into difficulties, and me too, right? So the solution the things that we reach out to them are often insulting to the people in power and who have actually the tools and the instruments and the positions to have a will of power that actually makes an impact, right? And devolving that onto the shoulders of individual street cops is simply not enough. That kind of liberal intervention is simply not enough. So we're facing a difficulty here. And this is a worldwide problem. But we really have to wrap up. And thank you very much for being here. I'll see you in November.
Thank you.
See you in Denver.